Hey everybody, tis welcome to Multi-Voice Entertainment. I'm Michael A. Grimm, aka Multi-Voice. I have many voices, but one opinion. And today I got something to talk about, ladies and gentlemen. And what I'm going to be talking about is this. Is Sherlock Holmes a comic book character? Is he a superhero? Well, let's dig into it, shall we? A long time ago, when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle written his first book of Sherlock Holmes, most of his Sherlock Holmes stories appeared in this certain magazine called the Strand Magazine. Now, for those of you who want to know about the Strand Magazine, they're kind of like pulp fiction magazines of their time. It's full of short stories. They're about the size of a Reader's Digest. And when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wanted to create a character who is a detective, he created Sherlock Holmes and his trusty assistant, Dr. Watson. Now, of course, I've heard that there were other detectives before Sherlock Holmes. There is that one detective from Edgar Allan Poe, Murders in the Rue Morgue. There was another detective from another story, which it kind of escapes me. But Sherlock Holmes was the cut above the rest. And of course, Sherlock Holmes, he's supposed to be the world's greatest detective because his mind is calculating. He has a thought process where he kind of thinks constantly, 24/7, which kind of brings me to thought. Does Sherlock Holmes is Sherlock Holmes in the spectrum? Maybe. I don't know. After all, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle did base Sherlock Holmes from his from a medical. When Sir Arthur Conan Doyle went to medical school, he had a teacher who goes by the name of Dr. Joseph Bell, and his mind was a lot like Sherlock Holmes, and that's where he based it from. So it's kind of hard to say that the Dr. Joseph Bell might be on the spectrum or not. But of course, not many people didn't know anything about autism or idiot savants or Asperger's back in the Victorian era. So it's kind of hard to say that Sherlock Holmes has a spectrum. But of course, there are also other characters involved in the story who gets involved with Sherlock Holmes, like Inspector Lestrade. And of course, the Baker Street irregulars. They're like a group of kids who are street urchins. They're like the eyes and ears in the streets. They overhear and they see what goes on in the street, and they tell Sherlock Holmes what goes on. And of course, he has a brother who goes by the name of Minecraft Holmes. Minecraft Holmes, he works in British intelligence, and he always looks down to his brother Sherlock because he thinks him being a private investigator and a consultant to the cops is a waste of talent. Well, if you ask me, you want to keep a secret on my thoughts about Minecraft? He's a pompous ass. That's what I think of him. And of course, every hero always have a villain, and that one character called Professor James Moriarty. He's known as the Napoleon of crime, and he's like the Joker to Sherlock Holmes' Batman. And of course, one thing about Watson is that Watson meets a woman in the case called The Sign of Four, where Dr. Watson meets Mary Morstan. But of course, it kind of begs the question, what exactly is the point of Sherlock Holmes? Does he ever fall in love with any girl? Well, one thing I do know about Sherlock Holmes is that he's old-fashioned Victorian way, because he doesn't think highly about women, because he always know they're manipulative and they're really good at lying, better than a man can. I mean, I'm not being sexist here. It's just how Sherlock Holmes is. But also, there was one movie that kind of explains the way Sherlock Holmes is because there's a movie called The 7% Solution, starring Nicol Williamson, who plays Sherlock, Robert Duvall is Watson, and of course Alan Arkin is Sigmund Freud. And he asked Sherlock what's his problem with women, and he said he remembered in his childhood that his mother was cheating on his father, and when his father saw them cheating, he killed her, so that kind of triggered his problem with women. But of course, I know some of you are going to be telling me about the scandal of Burma with Irene Adler. I mean, Sherlock Holmes did declare Irene Adler, he called her the woman, who is the very first woman who ever outsmarted him. But, I mean, I know a lot of people kind of think of a romance between Sherlock Holmes and Irene Adler, thinking that they should be together because she's the smartest woman, he's the smartest man. But she's more like Catwoman to Sherlock Holmes' Batman. I mean, it's pretty obvious Batman is mostly based from Sherlock Holmes, in a way. But a lot of people don't even know about a certain woman that Sherlock Holmes really did fancy, and it was in the case of the Copper Beeches, and it was Violet Hunter. Now, he helped her while she was being hired as a governess, and the boss had her look like her daughter in some odd way. But it kind of showed that Sherlock Holmes did have feelings for Violet. But one thing, it's pretty obvious, Sherlock Holmes is asexual. He's not gay, he's just asexual. I mean, I know a lot of people say that Sherlock Holmes should be gay because he's with Watson all the time, but, and I'm not trying to be homophobic about it, but it's obvious that Sherlock Holmes is asexual. And anybody whoever thinks about making Sherlock Holmes gay would be a good thing, well, deal with Stephen Fry. I mean, he's gay, he's funny, he's British, and he's a big fan of Sherlock Holmes, and the thought about making Sherlock Holmes gay, he said it is rubbish. Making Sherlock Holmes is the most terrible thing to do. So it's pretty obvious Sherlock Holmes is asexual. That's why he never fancies any girl or fall in love with any girl at all. I mean, he can fall in love, but he doesn't go that far. I mean, that's one thing about asexual people. They understand romance, but when it comes to sex, they're just not interested. But my favorite Sherlock Holmes stories of all time is none other than Hound of the Baskerville. I always love that story because I love the mythos about the Hound of Hell. And that's what gave me the idea of one of my mysteries involving a guy who thinks he's a werewolf. It's in one of my books that I've written years ago, but I never had it published. But anyway, when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle got sick and tired of writing books for Sherlock Holmes, and when they were doing like plays and theatrical things about Sherlock Holmes, it was that one actor who goes by the name of William Gillette who decided to make his Sherlock Holmes be heterosexual and have a relationship with Irene Adler. So, pretty much the whole Irene Adler deal with Sherlock Holmes was all William Gillette's idea. So now you know where all that came from. Speaking of movies in Sherlock Holmes, I do enjoy Basil Rathbone. I mean, he was. I mean, I enjoy his performance of Sherlock Holmes. I think he did a pretty good job as Sherlock Holmes. And even though he, I mean, just like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Basil Rathbone gets fed up of doing Sherlock Holmes because, I mean, every actor who plays Sherlock Holmes their own way, they have their own voice. And that's why I decided if I'm playing Sherlock Holmes, I'd rather not just use a British accent and play Holmes my own way. I mean, I don't go like, Elementary, my dear Watson. Hello, I'm Sherlock Holmes. I like to make an homage to a certain actor who did play Sherlock Holmes 3 times, but he knows more about Sherlock Holmes. Is the late great Christopher Lee. And how I will play him will be like this: I am Sherlock Holmes. Elementary, my dear Watson. And that's my that's how I'm going to portray Sherlock Holmes as Christopher Lee playing Sherlock Holmes. Oh, one more thing I had to add. If you want to see a really good origin story of Sherlock Holmes, check out Steven Spielberg's Young Sherlock Holmes, starring Nicholas Rowe, who did an outstanding performance of Sherlock Holmes, and Alan Cox as young John Watson. And it had a little bit of a Harry Potter vibe to it because the scriptwriter who written this movie also did the script writing for the Harry Potter films. And of course, some of you people are going to be nagging me on this one. I enjoyed Robert Downey Jr. from the Guy Ritchie version of Sherlock Holmes. Guy Ritchie, he did an outstanding story. I mean, he took a really awesome take of Sherlock Holmes. And Robert Downey Jr., for an American man, he did a pretty good Sherlock Holmes. And to be honest, I liked him better as Sherlock Holmes than Iron Man. And speaking of that, I also enjoyed the series Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch. And you know, Benedict Cumberbatch as Doctor Strange, he was right about one thing. Iron Man is a douchebag. And I also do enjoy that watered-down, Americanized version of Elementary. I thought this Sherlock Holmes was really good, and I also can't get enough of Lucy Liu playing Dr. Watson. I mean, I love Lucy Liu. I mean, she's beautiful, she's talented, she's really good, and her playing Watson, it's just perfect. So damn perfect. Excuse me while I drink myself some Schweppes. I love Schweppes, my favorite ginger ale. Oh, that's good stuff. Anyway. And another Sherlock Holmes I had to mention, I have seen that movie Mr. Holmes starring Sir Ian McKellen. I thought it was a really good take to see a very old and absent-minded Sherlock Holmes that Sir Ian McKellen did do a pretty good job playing. And I also saw the Netflix series Enola Holmes on Netflix. There's one thing I gotta say about the actress who plays Enola Holmes. Molly Bobby Brown. Does she look like Natalie Portman? I mean, ever since she grew her hair long after she was done playing Eleven on Stranger Things, and she let her hair grow a little longer, I don't know, something about her, she just looks more like Natalie Portman. I mean, it's kind of odd, because I always thought Keira Knightley looks like Natalie Portman, except Keira Knightley has a bit of, sort of, underbite, like me. An underbite. But now Molly is starting to look more like Natalie Portman. I mean, heck, if she stars in a movie with Natalie Portman, she would have played her younger sister. Think about it. Just like I thought that Billie Eilish, she would be perfect to play Scarlett Johansson's younger sister, since they both do look alike as well. I'm not kidding. I think Billie Eilish looks like Scarlett Johansson's younger sister. And also, not many people know that Enola Holmes was based by a series of books. And now I hear that the descendant of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is now suing Enola Holmes for using their persona of Sherlock. Sherlock Holmes has been out in the public domain. Why sue now? I think it's because they don't like Henry Superman Cavill as Sherlock Holmes in that version. But, to my opinion, who I think is the best Sherlock Holmes is none other than Jeremy Brent. Jeremy Brent did an outstanding performance of Sherlock Holmes. I mean, he plays Sherlock Holmes more than any actor I know. And what makes him so special is because Jeremy Brent has bipolar. I mean, he's bipolar, so that pretty much qualifies him to play Sherlock Holmes, where Sherlock Holmes took some heroin and he's in a down spiral. I mean, it's a lot like how a person with bipolar would act. And I always kept thinking, would Disney ever make their version of Sherlock Holmes? Much to my surprise, they did. They made The Great Mouse Detective. Based on a series of books. But to me, my favorite cartoon series of Sherlock Holmes I really do like is, of course, Sherlock Holmes and the 22nd Century. I mean, think about it. I mean, you have Sherlock Holmes in Victoria, London, which some of the things happening around them would be, I would say, be more like steampunk. So why not a Sherlock Holmes in a cyberpunk future? Where he has a cyborg John Watson and an evil clone of Moriarty and a descendant of Lestrade bringing him back to life. It'll work. And of course, I know that the Japanese did an anime. First time they ever did an anime of Sherlock Holmes was, of course, Sherlock Hound. Oh yeah, I also forgot that the Japanese did a female version of Sherlock Holmes called Miss Sherlock Holmes. A Japanese female Sherlock Holmes. Who'd have thunk it? And of course, to my opinion, I like Wishbone as Sherlock Holmes. Now, when it comes to me and comedy, you know me, I love comedy. I enjoy watching comedy. But I saw a certain Sherlock Holmes parody made, and it was terrible. It was really, really terrible. And it was Holmes and Watson, starring Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly. That wasn't a good parody of Sherlock Holmes at all. I mean, it was a disaster. To my opinion, what was a better Sherlock Holmes parody? I would say Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother, starring Gene Wilder. And also, Without a Clue, starring Michael Caine. You were supposed to blow the bloody doors off. I play Sherlock Holmes. Well, actually, I actually played an actor who goes by the name of Kincaid, who pretended to be Sherlock Holmes, while Ben Kingsley, who is Watson, starts writing his stories, but putting himself as Sherlock Holmes, and I'm just putting the look of Holmes himself, while he acts like Watson. Which I gotta say, it's not often that you see Ben Kingsley in a comedy, because most movies you see Ben Kingsley in is mostly dramas and horror and suspenseful thrillers. So you never seen Ben Kingsley in a comedy before until you seen Without a Clue.
Hey everybody, 'tis I, Michael A. Grimm, aka the Multi-Voice. This is a short video I'm going to be talking about, and the one I'm going to be talking about is this. The reason why I didn't mention it on my last video is because I was never into the Gnome movies, to the Gnome franchise, because this movie was a sequel to another movie I didn't want to pay attention of, Romeo and Juliet. And it was a parody to one of William Shakespeare's stories, Romeo and Juliet. And I hate Romeo and Juliet. It was just one of the Shakespeare stories that I just really didn't care anything about. I mean, I never did like Romeo and Juliet, so what makes you think I'm going to like Romeo and Juliet? And this here is a sequel to the Romeo and Juliet story, except this time there's a mystery involved and you have a gnome who's like Sherlock Holmes. Yeah, I thought that's a crazy idea ever. And another thing it does blew me off is, of course, Johnny Depp playing Sherlock Gnomes. My opinion to Johnny Depp, if he wants to play Sherlock Holmes, do it live. I mean, he did an outstanding job acting like Sherlock Holmes on that Tim Burton version of Legend of Sleepy Hollow. But him doing the voice? No, it's not for him. And yes, for those of you who are going to be asking me, yes, I've heard about the trial of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. And my opinion, it's all her fault because she's a crazy witch. I never thought that a beautiful girl like her turned out to be crazy. But this is my opinion about this. I mean, I never did like Romeo and Juliet because of Romeo and Juliet. So, I don't think I'm ready to watch this movie at all, and I don't even think it would be my interest. That's why I didn't mention it on my last video. So, this is my opinion about it, and thank you for watching.
But, of course, enough about everything I had to say about Sherlock Holmes. I'm going back to the whole persona about the comic book part. I mean, since the Strand magazine ended Sherlock Holmes, there's no stopping Sherlock Holmes when it comes to movies and TV shows that I mentioned, but what about the comic book, Well, my opinion, I would say, about Sherlock Holmes is the comic book adaptation of Sherlock Holmes created by the classic illustrated series. Classic illustrated series, I mean, they take every single story and just make a comic book adaptation out of it. And they did a pretty good job on the Sherlock Holmes part. And of course, since Sherlock Holmes is a public domain, it changed comic book company to company to company. I mean, Marvel did their version of Hound of the Baskerville. DC did a few comic books of Sherlock Holmes, even Sherlock Holmes crossing over with Batman. But right now, one comic book company owned the rights of Sherlock Holmes and made their own series, which is Dynamite Entertainment. Yeah, Dynamite Entertainment decided to make their adaptation of Sherlock Holmes. Some of them are based from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's book, and others are just made-up stories. And I have to say, it is pretty interesting to see of Sherlock Holmes who just don't even know when to die. I mean, heck, when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle did that one story where Sherlock Holmes was battling against Moriarty in the cliffs, he thought that was one way that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle can kill Sherlock. But sadly, diehard fans want more and didn't want to take his death lying down. Just like all the other actors who were typecast playing Sherlock Holmes, some of them do get sick and tired of playing it, just like how some actors are sick and tired of playing Batman or Superman. But I guess Sherlock Holmes never dies. Just like the Doctor, he never dies either. And neither does James Bond or any other heroes that you know. Well, this is my review for the day. If you like this theory that I'm talking about and everything about Sherlock Holmes, please leave a comment down below, hit like and subscribe for more videos. And I'm the multi-voice reviewer. I remember it so I can jog your memory.
I do accept what he says. Everything he says was right about Sherlock Holmes. Even I know the world's greatest detective. And if you disagree with me, if you don't disagree with Multi-Voice Reviewer, I'm coming for you. Because I'm Batman!
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, 'tis I, Michael A. Grimm, aka the Multi-Voice. I have many voices, but one opinion. And today, as you notice, I finally got my Christmas present here. The, Sherlock Holmes Omnibus from Dynamite Entertainment. And, you know, there have been a lot of Sherlock Holmes comic books throughout the years. I mean, since superheroes were pretty big back in the time, there were a lot of comic book companies, since Sherlock Holmes is a public domain, they decided to, every company made their own version of Sherlock Holmes. Like there was the famous classic Illustrated. And even DC did a couple Sherlock Holmes comics. Marvel, of course. And also they did one where there was Deadpool Illustrated, which is supposed to be picked up after Deadpool kills the Marvel Universe left off. After he killed the superheroes, he decided to go into a universe where there's a lot of illustrated characters who were inspiration to our Marvel heroes. And Sherlock Holmes was in it. And of course, Dell Comics did theirs. Dark Horse. Image did two, except one was called Five Ghosts, about a guy who is possessed by 5 legendary ghosts. Sherlock Holmes is one of them, and so is Robin Hood, Dracula, Merlin the Wizard, and also some samurai, which name escapes me. And also, Image did a comic book series of Moriarty. And of course, IDW. Golden Age Comics. And even there was a comic book crossover of Kojak the Night Stalker meets Sherlock Holmes. And of course there are some weird ones too, like there's a comic book series called Sherlock Ninja. Even the Japanese, they become huge fans of Sherlock Holmes, that their Japanese comic book company, Manga, they did Sherlock. And of course they also did another one called Moriarty Patriot. And they also did an anime based from it. And there's also a young Miss Holmes, so she must be a daughter of Sherlock Holmes. And of course, another company had Sherlock Holmes dealing with going to the dark side. Like there is the Victorian Undead. On that one, Sherlock Holmes deals with zombies, and then Dracula, and then Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and probably werewolves. And there's also another series of Sherlock Holmes called Watson and Holmes. On this one, Sherlock Holmes and Watson are black and they're in New York, and they're going through the same situation as our original Sherlock Holmes and Watson goes through. But enough about all those versions of Sherlock Holmes. Let's dig into the Dynamite Entertainment of Sherlock Holmes Omnibus. And now this is going to be a three-parter, ladies and gentlemen, because, as you can see, this book is really long here. And I'm making this video as a three-parter. So let's dig with the first story called Sherlock Holmes Year 1 and see exactly how did Sherlock Holmes... exactly what did Dynamite Entertainment did for Sherlock Holmes. So let's dig into it. Now, one thing I gotta say, it all starts out with the story on Year 1 where it says, the butlers did it. There is this inspector, which is not Lestrade, and of course Watson examined some of the bodies, and there was Sherlock Holmes wrapped in a blanket. And the inspector was trying to figure out what just happened. And of course, Watson showed up, trying to examine the whole thing, and asked Sherlock Holmes some questions. And of course, did a little bit of a backstory. You see, Sherlock Holmes Year 1 talks about their backstory before they ended up together and start solving mysteries together. And of course, Watson talks about his years in Afghanistan, in the Victorian era, not in today time, where he got wounded during battle. At the same time, there was a rich family who was having some kind of dinner party, and every single servant was wearing masks. And of course, Sherlock Holmes himself knew there was something suspicious going on, so he went in disguise as one of their servants. And after figuring out what was going on, Holmes finally realized that all these servants are poisoning their hosts one by one. They start feeding them poison. And of course, when they discover that Sherlock Holmes is not one of the servants who is not in with them, they decided to kill him by shoving poison down his throat. While the maid, who is the ringleader, told all the servants to go into their bedroom. And Sherlock Holmes... some of the evil servants took Sherlock Holmes to the top of their castle. Sherlock Holmes, being smart, he regurgitated himself so he can get the poison out of his system, and then knock out the servant. Him and one of the servants fell into the water. And of course, the servant he knocked out died. While all the servants, they started raiding their house. Since they killed the hosts, they decided to take all their valuable jewelry. How about that? Poisoning them just to get their jewelry. Until all of a sudden, Sherlock Holmes told them where they are. They were trying to get on boat so they can make a getaway. But of course, the inspector stopped them and round them all up. Meanwhile, Sherlock Holmes is in the university college, and he's talking to a professor who starts telling him about Greek legends and such. But Sherlock Holmes left after the bell rang. And of course, Watson, getting a little suspicious of Sherlock Holmes. And of course, it's the first time where young Sherlock Holmes himself put on the steerstalker hat. Now, on this second page, it turns out that there was a guy who was brutally murdered in the middle of the street. Looked like he was stabbed to death. in the middle of the street. And the inspector started arguing with Watson over his death, and a woman showed up with makeup smeared down, looked like she's been crying, and there was a letter that she was supposed to give to the guy, but the inspector, he thought of her as the murderer, but Watson knew that she was innocent. And the letter was, it's at grandmother where you eat. And of course the inspector starts harassing the girl, telling him the truth about what happened, which she was innocent. Anyway, Watson found Sherlock Holmes' room, which turns out to be a huge mess. And that's when he finally discovered that, at first he thought that Sherlock Holmes might be a bad guy, but he does discover that he's just a crime solver. And now Sherlock Holmes is sword fighting with one of the guys inside of a boat, doing some sword fighting skills, martial arts sword fighting. It turns out that Sherlock Holmes was learning the skills of sword fighting thanks to his teacher. Watson showed up and tried to stop the fight, but he said it's okay, it's just a training technique. And of course, after they were done giving him exactly what he wanted, teaching how to fight, they thought he was giving them opium, but it turns out it's just a sugar pill he was giving them. Now, of course, meanwhile, there was a play. They're trying to do a Roman Caesar play. And then from out of nowhere, a suspicious guy grabs the actor who played the Caesar and cram a note down his throat until he choked him to death. At least that's a horrible way to die. And as for the guy who was stabbed to death in the middle of the street, Watson decided to examine the body, but Holmes was focusing the details until 3 shady-looking guys showed up and said that this body belongs to them, so they're going to be doing some research. And Watson tried to stop them, but they had rights to examine the body themselves. And then they found a note. It was crammed inside the guy's throat. And of course, Sherlock Holmes did this. Long live Caesar! Odd, isn't it? And then another death happened. Some suspicious killer wearing a hood and a long cloak grabs this one guy. He was kind of strangling him. I mean, he had a rope around his neck, strangling him, forcing him towards the stairs. And then after he was done strangling him, he pushed him downstairs and laid another note. And one inspector thought they grabbed the guy who was all big and bulky and bald. But we all know it's not him. He kept on saying, Amos, amas, amat. Apomana, apomun, apomanas, apomat. I mean, he's saying things in, like, alphabetical ways while all the guys are trying to take him down, trying to hold him down, but he's just too big and strong until they finally knock him out by using the butt of the gun. After found the body who was thrown down the stairs, there was, like, pieces of coin laying next to the victim. So, Watson was talking to one of his old friends in the bar, saying something about the ship called the Georgie Scott, and heard that ship exploded, and there were a few survivors from that place. Georgie Scott it's a prison ship. Yeah, that's right, a prison ship. where they transfer prisoners to one cell to the next. And here lies a picture where it's a picture of young Sherlock Holmes and, of course, his old friend, Victor Trevor. Now, Victor Trevor, one thing I know about him is that according to Arthur Conan Doyle stories, Victor Trevor turns out that he is Sherlock Holmes' old childhood friend. Anyway, Sherlock Holmes went to the opium den and asked a couple of guys a couple of questions about these notes laying next to the victim. And they don't even know what it means. But they didn't want any witnesses, so they were trying to take him down, but Sherlock Holmes knocked him out with his trusty cane. And a couple of cops showed up and arrested Sherlock Holmes for disturbing the peace in the opium den. Watson walks up to the professor in the university, asking him some questions about death of Caesars and such. And when Watson left the university, there was a bunch of teenage punks who started to throw liquid substance on top of Watson. So him and one of the constables got out of the way. Meanwhile, Sherlock Holmes ended up in prison with one of the pickpocketers. And when Watson got Holmes out of the jail cell, Holmes collapsed towards Watson, and he pickpocketed him, showing that he's really... Holmes was really good with pickpocketing. Even the prisoner said, "Drafty boy." But of course it's really strange how these deaths have been happening, because most of them are dying the same way as the Caesars. Like, there was a guy in the bell knocking boxing. He was betting for the winner on the bare knocking boxing, and he won a lot of money, and he had 2 ladies with him. And somebody who disguised himself as a constable stabbed him to death in the middle of the street. And another one, who was in a diner trying to enjoy his meal, somebody put poison, arsenic, in his food. Die as another Caesar. And here's another one, which I'm familiar with this Caesar, Nero. Remember the old saying, Nero fiddled while Rome burned? Well, this guy, he was tied to a chair, so the only thing he had to do while his house is on fire is fiddling his violin. And of course he didn't want to die burning to death, so he also had a knife in his hand. So he dropped his violin and his bow and stabbed himself to death with a knife, so he would not suffer from the flames. So there's 3 people died in the most horrible way as different types of Caesars. And each of them have notes saying that they're all referencing the same death of Caesars throughout history. And there's even news saying that there is the Grim Reaper going out killing people who were Caesars, who are descendants of all the Caesars throughout history. And of course there's a group of constable who's bringing in a body and a small box, but one of the constable dropped it. Turns out it was a decapitated head. Looked like one of the Caesars got beheaded. I mean, one of the victims who was supposed to resemble one of the Caesars. So Sherlock Holmes decided to visit his old friend's place, Victor Trevor's apartment. Turns out that Victor Trevor hanged himself. And Sherlock Holmes had a lot of good memory about his friend Victor. He met him in the university, in college. He was his roommate. He always sleeps. I mean, he always been a heavy sleeper, so he always slaps him to wake him up. And therefore he meets a very beautiful girl who is a good singer, which turns out to be Irene Adler. And of course, Victor and his father, called Justice Trevor, he's a judge, were fishing, and he carries a cane. But when he mentioned about something about what does the initials J.A. mean, Justice Trevor collapsed. But of course he had a tattoo on his arm, has the initials J.A. in it. And of course Victor decided to take him home. But as Watson was checking the body of Victor, turns out he doesn't have the initials. They got a knock on the door. Turns out one of the constable heard a report. And now there is another death. Another guy who died the same way as Otho. He died with a pillow on his chest and a knife right through the pillow and his chest. And as the inspector was getting exhausted from all those deaths, the hooded figure knocked the inspector out and dragged him. Meanwhile, Irene Adler showed up in front of Sherlock Holmes' room. Turns out that she was in a relationship with Victor Trevor, but now Victor Trevor's dead. And it turns out that her and Holmes had a sort of fling going on. And of course, Watson kind of thinks of Holmes as, sometimes it's weird, Holmes, that you always end up with a girl like her. But anyway, the inspector was hog-tied into a pole. And the hooded man says, "I am the next king of England." And he had all of his men throw excrement all over him. Cui bono, whatever that means. But anyway, Sherlock Holmes showed Irene Adler where Trevor is at. She couldn't believe that he died. While at the same time, the bad guy, the murderer, the one who wore a hood, still had the inspector just covered with excrement tied to a pole. And he decided to strike a final blow by pouring more excrement toward him. Make him suffer that way, maybe die from it, from the fumes and everything. While Irene Adler, Sherlock Holmes, and Watson, they finally figured out something. George C. Scott was a prison place until they left all the crew members and the prisoners and the guards behind, and somebody put a bomb on George C. Scott and exploded. And while the prisoners was making their escape, they found somebody floating on the water who turns out he was a final survivor, and he witnessed how it exploded because somebody lit the gunpowder. And they all made a promise never to mention Georgie Scott. And of course, the guy who survived from all this showed up right in front of Justice Trevor's place. Because Justice Trevor was one of the prisoners who escaped the boat. And he died worried about the guy who survived the boat. So now, Sherlock Holmes started figuring out exactly what's going on. While at the same time, a wagon showed up right in front of the constable and tossed the inspector's body over, and the inspector died. One of the constables said, "What happened?" And the inspector says, "No one, nobody special, a teacher." Sherlock Holmes, Irene Adler, and Watson got captured, and it turns out that they're in a basement of an abandoned factory, and it turns out that the university teacher, he showed up and telling them why is he killing all these people. And of course he also has a lot of jars full of nitroglycerin, very explosive chemicals. And the reason why all this is happening, it's because, now spoilers for those of you who just want to read the book, so there's going to be spoilers ahead on this, folks, so bear with me. Turns out that the teacher himself is Professor James Moriarty, the Napoleon of crime. And the reason why he's doing this, it's because a long time ago when the final Caesar was assassinated, turns out that there was a son, there was another descendant who should be rightful for the throne, but they kept him hidden away from prying eye so people will never know. And his real name was actually Moritura, also known as Moriarty. So it turns out he's another descendant of the Caesars of Rome. And of course Sherlock Holmes went one-on-one against Moriarty while the others made their escape and tossed over the nitroglycerin, so now the whole building is on fire. And of course they left Moriarty behind, and they thought Moriarty's gone, but no, he's not. He always cheats death. So now Watson rented a apartment building in 221B Baker Street, and Sherlock Holmes and Irene Adler, they say their farewell, but they will meet again soon, which I know they will. So Sherlock Holmes shook hands with Watson, and they decided to work together in their first case, which is a body where there's a ring, and of course written in his blood is R-A-C-H-E, which that pretty much left the beginning of the first Sherlock Holmes story, Study in Scarlet. And that is the Sherlock Holmes Year One. Now, I thought it was a really neat story and an interesting idea of having young Sherlock Holmes start his first mission and meet Moriarty for the first time. Now, I'm going to end this right now, but stay tuned for the next story, The Trial of Sherlock Holmes. Because the trial of Sherlock Holmes, he gets arrested for murder, and turns out he was innocent as a rouge. So, please stay tuned. I'm Michael A. Graham, a.k.a. the Multi-Voice Reviewer. I remember it so I can jog your memory. Hey everyone, welcome back. Since you enjoyed part 1, time to get to part 2, to the second story of Sherlock Holmes, The Trial of Sherlock Holmes. And I have to say that this is the most interesting story because you never even heard any Sherlock Holmes mystery where Sherlock Holmes gets blamed for something he didn't do. And this is a really interesting story, to say the least. So let's, so this is part 2 of Sherlock Holmes Omnibus, Trial of Sherlock Holmes, and see how this story goes. From the beginning, there was a guy who was, threading his button on his jacket, and then he put on his jacket and left, and he forgot something. He forgot his hat, and as he went back home, his building blew up, and now a bunch of firefighters showed up to put out the fire. Meanwhile, Watson was reading the newspaper, and he finally got to 221B Baker Street, and therefore found Sherlock Holmes staring out in the window, like Sherlock Holmes always does, puffing his pipe. And then they read the letter saying that it was almost an assassination attempt. And they sent Sherlock Holmes and Watson into their house to check out the guy who almost got killed. They found an old maid who works there. And then a strange, odd, familiar gentleman showed up. This guy right here. He showed up wondering what is the meaning of all this and why is Mr. Holmes doing here. And all of a sudden, all the clocks kept dinging, going like ding dong, chung chung, bong bong, bing bong bong bong, bing bong bong, bing bing bong, bong bing bong bong. And it was time for Sherlock Holmes to go upstairs to meet the old man and who is bedridden in his home. Sherlock Holmes went upstairs to meet the old guy. Then all of a sudden there was a big bang, and the man I showed you heard the bang, and he told everybody to go back in. They all ran up the stairs, and they bust through the door, and surprisingly, they found Sherlock Holmes with a gun in his hand and a dead body right there. And Sherlock Holmes said, I didn't. No, I didn't know what to do. I don't know what to do. They checked the body, absolutely saying he's dead. And then that bald bearded guy, the one I showed you, found a piece of paper that was almost burnt to the fireplace. Even Watson stared at Holmes, saying, Holmes, what have you done? Why? And Watson said, Watson, I didn't. It all happened so fast. I didn't know how to stop him. But, sadly, they've arrested Sherlock Holmes for suspicion of murder. And then they talked to the commissioner, saying that Sherlock Holmes was framed. He didn't do it. He's innocent. But the bald guy has his head so far up his ass, he just keeps on assuming that Sherlock Holmes did it for some suspicion over the notes that he'd written that almost threw into the fireplace. What in the hell is that guy's problem? You know what he starts to remind me of? J. Jonah Jameson from Spider-Man. Back then, when I used to like Spider-Man, I hated J. Jonah Jameson, because he always loved spreading lies about Spider-Man, saying that he's a menace to society. And of course, there was another character I also hated from another franchise, Live Wire. I mean, she was a radio DJ who spread lies, saying bad stuff about Superman. And according to the comic books, she was a public radio broadcaster who says a lot of bad stuff about Superman until her boss told her to stop. And she was like, why? The people have the right to know how much of a fraud Superman is. And he says, Superman saved my wife from near death. And if you won't stop, you're fired. But of course, she didn't listen, so he blackballed her. And now she wouldn't work to any radio because she just wouldn't shut up about Superman. And all of a sudden she gets electrocuted, and now she has electricity ability. I mean, he just makes me think of that character. That character starts to make me think of those characters. But anyway, Sherlock Holmes in the jail cell, and some bum showed up who wanted to go back to that cell, but sadly, Sherlock Holmes is in it. So he just took off drunk in his whiskey. And of course there was Miss Hutchison showed up, and she knew it was a scandal. She knows that Sherlock Holmes is innocent. And Watson showed up as well. And she tried to reason to the guy, but he just wouldn't listen. Meanwhile, Queen Victoria was having a dinner party with some of the ambassadors from other countries. And of course, Inspector Lestrade was there as well. Watson, trying to figure out who is responsible, who killed the guy and framed Holmes from it. And he come up with one name, Moriarty, but he was like, nah, this is useless. Moriarty has nothing to do with it, which he's right. I mean, Moriarty is more cunning than that. I mean, Moriarty wouldn't kill someone and blame Holmes for it. Would he? I mean, I know the Joker wouldn't kill someone and blame the Batman. I guess that's one thing about villains. They don't want their superhero to get blamed for something they didn't do. Anyway, Lestrade had a little talk with that bearded guy. And some homeless guy showed up, trying to sneak into the jail cell, and they kicked him out. Could that be Holmes in disguise? Nah. Hard to say. But, Lestrade showed up and argued with Watson over Sherlock Holmes. That Watson himself decided to go back to that house and see if there's any evidence. Because one thing that Watson remembered about Holmes is that Holmes can see the details of the situation. But he was getting better on trying to figure out the details. But anyway, he looked around, and all those darn clocks started ding-donging everywhere. Anyway, Scotland Yard was making themselves a cup of tea, and as it turns out, Holmes wasn't in the jail cell. That bum was Holmes. It looks like one of the constable was wearing Sherlock Holmes' clothing, so Sherlock Holmes escaped from prison and disguised himself as one of the constable. Now, Mrs. Hudson was making Watson something to eat, but he just couldn't eat because he still thinks about Holmes being in jail. Meanwhile, Lestrade is in Buckingham Palace, where Queen Victoria is at, and all of a sudden all the officers went like this because Queen Victoria was leaving the dining room. So, you know, every time when the royalty passed by, you got to show your respects. And that guy who wanted Holmes to be put in jail showed up and told Lestrade, don't get yourself involved in the case with Holmes. It's obvious he didn't. And of course Lestrade saying, yes, sir. While there is this homeless who went upstairs to an apartment, and some guy with a mustache turns out that he's a reporter. So the reporter might know something? Try to contact Watson, but Mrs. Hudson won't let him in. Anyway, somebody tried to attack this bearded homeless guy until he knocked him out of the window and landed on a wagon full of cloth, so he survived. Anyway, they went to the greenhouse, and it turns out that that there's a newspaper saying that Baron Luther visited London. And Baron Luther, he's an ambassador of Germany. I mean, he's a baron of Germany. And the reporter is showing the newspaper. It turns out that the homeless guy was Holmes in disguise. And then all of a sudden in the greenhouse, the Baron was passing by, and somebody was firing their pistol, and it fired but misses the Baron, but Lestrade grabbed the Baron and have him duck. So the bearded guy had all the constables searching the premises to see where the assassin is at. While Watson, on the other hand, he wanted help. So he went to British intelligence and contacted his brother Lestrade. See if he probably help out any way he can. But of course, not Lestrade, Mycroft. Sherlock Holmes' brother, Mycroft. He had a chat with Watson, but sadly, for the sake of the embassy, he cannot get Sherlock Holmes out of prison. So Watson was kind of down about it. But here's a known fact. Sherlock Holmes, in disguise of the bearded homeless guy, he sat down in the diner while Mycroft was sitting in a table behind him. And they both were talking to each other what's going on. Well, Mycroft told him everything. While the bearded bald guy started arguing with somebody else over the whole deal with Holmes being in jail and all. And the assassination attempt to the Baron. And then the former constable, I guess he must have lost his job because of Holmes. And he found Holmes in disguise as the constable, so he tackled him. And here's one interesting fact. Lestrade visited the Baron, and he saw a copy of Strand magazine. Turns out that the Baron, he's a fan to Sherlock Holmes. He follows his adventures with great interest. And it was him who sent a letter to Holmes before they went to that house. Anyway, Watson started looking about, and he found a letter written by Holmes in disguise, letting him know that he escaped and he's in disguise. Meanwhile, the constable got his uniform, and of course, the reporter in Scotland Yard, that reporter, the newspaper reporter, he found Sherlock Holmes coming out of the wagon with one of the constable having his hand on handcuffs, discovered that he was being arrested for crimes he didn't commit. So they went to the museum and had a chat with the curator in the museum. But of course, there was a lot of familiar things, a lot of suspicious things been happening. Like, there's a group of people who kept on arresting people at random for no reason. And somebody tries to tell them that they are innocent, they get punched. Even an artist who was sleeping with one of the ladies, a couple of constables barged in and just took the artist and destroyed his paintings. And another constable, there was a house full of homeless people. They barged in and took the guy away. While Watson was in the wagon during the one rainy night, there was another wagon that got tipped over. And it turns out that the owner was crying and pleading for somebody to help him because his son is trapped under that wagon. The son is trapped under that wagon. So Watson rushed in and helped the guy lift up that wagon and got his son out. While at the jail cell, a lawyer showed up. Well, not this lawyer, but the guy who was outraged over the bearded guy blaming Holmes. He went into the jail cell and into Holmes' cell and asked him some questions. And he told him what happened and told him what was going on. So Lestrade, looking out the window to make sure the Baron doesn't get harmed, Watson cleaned himself up and went outside. And then the jury started. Turns out that the jury has started with the Sherlock Holmes case. Sherlock Holmes murder. Sherlock Holmes pleaded not guilty, even though there are evidence against him. While at the same time, one of the servants told Lestrade that he needs to go to the Baron to send him some message. And they told the Baron that the trial has started. So the Baron decided to go to the trial. While the lawyers kept asking some of the other constables and also talked to Watson, and then they talked to the bearded moron, the one who blamed Holmes for the murder. Holmes stand and listen to him talking about what was going on. And Lestrade discovered that the Baron took off because the Baron wanted to see the trial and wanted to see Holmes himself. And after all this evidence they shown in the confessions, they even found an envelope. While at the same time, the Baron is now out in the crowd, and Lestrade is trying to find the Baron from a crowd of people trying to go into that trial. While at the same time, there was an assassin on top of one of the buildings ready to attempt another assassination. Sherlock Holmes just looked at the pictures and looked at everything. And of course, a newspaper reporter was contacting Watson to figure out what he discovered. While at the same time, the sniper was about ready to aim to the Baron. You see, the reporter knew what was going on, and he told Watson that there was two men on top of the building with a gun. And after Watson found one assassin, he fired his gun, shoot him in the shoulder, while the other assassin fired his gun. Didn't hit the Baron, but it hit Lestrade on the shoulder. While Watson aimed his gun, firing at him, trying to get the assassin. But surprisingly, that one assassin who's behind all this didn't want to get captured by the constables, so he jumped and fell to his death. So, they find the convenient not guilty. So, Sherlock Holmes was free. And after the trial, Sherlock Holmes in Minecraft was playing a little game of chess, talking about the whole situation and what happened. And as usual, Sherlock Holmes declared checkmate. His brother might be smart, but not as clever as Sherlock Holmes is. Now, that is the trial of Sherlock Holmes for today. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I gotta say, this was a pretty cunning and very lethal case ever. And it was all, Sherlock Holmes being blamed for murder, it was made to be a ruse so they can plan to assassinate the Baron of Germany. So they almost got it, and they almost convicted the world's greatest detective. Well, that's the end of this story so far, so stay tuned for the next case. The next case is going to be called Liverpool Demon. So stay tuned for Sherlock Holmes' final story, Liverpool Demon. And it's going to be the third and final story to Sherlock Holmes Omnibus. So if you like this review so far, please leave a comment down below, hit like and subscribe. And too bad I didn't show any pictures this time, so I might show some pictures, but who knows. So this is Michael A. Grimm, aka Multi-Voice Reviewer. I remembered so I can jog your memory. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Multi-Voice Entertainment. 'Tis I, Michael A. Grimm, aka the Multi-Voice. I have many voices, but one opinion. And today would mark as the final story to Sherlock Holmes Omnibus. Now, I told you the story about Sherlock Holmes Year 1, and then the trial of Sherlock Holmes. Now let's get to the final story to this omnibus, Liverpool Demon. So, moving right along, let's get to it, shall we? Liverpool Demon. Now, one thing I gotta say, this one takes place in Liverpool Docklands in August 1888. Where it turns out that there was somebody who was running away, and he was about ready to pull out a gun and fired it to one of the constables. Well, at the same time, one of the crates been released, and a bunch of parrots showed up. And, of course, the woman ran after the guy, and she hung on to him while the guy grabbed the rope, while a couple of constables was about ready to go after him. And then all of a sudden, bam! The guy got shot in the hand, and it was all because of Watson and Sherlock Holmes. And when they were about ready to apprehend the guy, the woman pulled out a blade and tried to attack Sherlock Holmes, but cut him in the arm. So, they both got apprehended. Meanwhile, during a rainy day, a couple of guys walking through Liverpool, and they tackled an old man, hoisted him to the wall, about ready to punch him, but they left him alone. Meanwhile, in Great North Western Hotel in the afternoon, Watson and Sherlock Holmes sat down, relaxed, and had a little talk while Watson attended to his wounds that he got from that woman. And the group of guys showed up, walked up to Holmes, and it turns out that they got a proposition for him. Turns out that there was a big brawl on Liverpool. A group of guys just beats up a helpless guy until a group of constables showed up and helped up the guy who got beat up. And it turns out one of them had a club. And this guy with a beard and no mustache shows up. So pretty much they wanted to know that there's something really suspicious going on in Liverpool. Turns out a lot of people think it was the work they found another body, and it's the same old man who got beat up outside of Liverpool. I mean, there was a big pool of blood and a huge scratch marks on his back. And then all of a sudden they found a mysterious figure with a cape standing on top of the building. And a lot of people think it's the work of the Spring Hill Jack. Now, I gotta stop the story for a moment for those of you who don't know what the Spring Hill Jack is. Well, one thing I know for sure. Spring Hill Jack was one of the most supernatural legends in the UK. It's been known all around Liverpool. Even some say that he was Jack the Ripper, but we all know that Jack the Ripper was never a demon. Some people say that he is a demon from hell who punished those in Europe, and they call him Spring Hill Jack because he can jump really high like he has springs in his shoes. And then all of a sudden they have him appeared on the Penny Dreadful novels, where now Spring Hill Jack becomes a vigilante, and a lot of people kept saying that's one of the inspiration for Batman. And also there is an author who writes books about Spring Hill Jack. So now you know the story about the Spring Hill Jack. Time for us to get back in the story. And who'd have thought that that creature... I mean, in London they have a mythical creature like Bigfoot or the Abominable Snowman or the Loch Ness Monster or the Deer Woman. And of course the El Chupacabra. Yeah, I do look up mythological monsters. But anyway, back to the story. Now, Sherlock Holmes kept reading newspapers. And even here's one, it shows, somebody just drew a picture of the Spring Hill Jack in the article on the newspaper. And of course, as usual, Sherlock Holmes scoffs over it, while Watson takes it seriously. You see, that's one thing I always knew about Sherlock Holmes and Watson. Sherlock Holmes, he's not much the believer in the supernaturals, and neither do I. While Watson, on the other hand, sometimes he kind of believes in the supernatural. And here is this guy with a big bushy mustache, asked this lady over, and she gave him a bag full of money, and thanks her. Meanwhile, Sherlock Holmes and Watson starts analyzing the body, and they start seeing the 3 scratch marks. And everybody's talking about what this body had gone through, and they analyze it, doing like an autopsy. Meanwhile, one of the constables with sideburns, he seems to act a little... he's the inspector. Let's see. Oh. His name is Inspector Thornton. Inspector Thornton, who seems to look a little shady, in a way, always gives Sherlock Holmes a hard time because he thinks he can solve this case better than Sherlock Holmes can. Meanwhile, in the lab, there's a butcher who's been doing a lot of experiments with his white mice. That 2 goons showed up, and one of them wearing a derby grabs a basket full of, grabs a cage full of the white mice. Even though the butcher yelled, "Leave them alone," he smashed them in the ground and they all scattered. So, Sherlock Holmes decided to go to St. Mary's, and he was talking to the old lady who's the housekeeper and one of their ministers, showing them a little something odd that goes on in the church. Turns out that there was a blood spot on the church. Meanwhile, there's a group of guys who was betting their money on a dogfight. Now, for those of you who don't know what dogfights are, it's a very illegal thing to do, where you have two dogs fighting against one another and you have to bet which one of them survives. That's why it's really illegal, because it's very cruel to animals. Even I agree about it. That's why I don't even like to hear about dogfights or cockfights or anything involved. Unless it's Robot Wars, then I'm interested. In the William Brown Museum, a couple of people start looking around the area, see if there's anything missing or anything, and then all of a sudden they heard a sound, and some of them thought it was a Spring Hill Jack, but it was just two guys having one of their dogs on a chain, and that dog was getting a little aggressive. All. And of course on the bottom it says, "Next, cat and mouse." Now, another day, there was a group of kids who was hanging out, and their pet dog is with them. And then all of a sudden they heard a sound, and one of the kids say it's the Spring Hill Jack. Meanwhile, some of the other people were just enjoying the breakfast, and Sherlock Holmes and that Thornton showed up. Now Thornton, he carries the club. He always carries around the club in case any of the crooks decided to get a little hostile. And then from out of nowhere, they found another body with the same scratch marks on his back. And there is a portrait that looks like some kind of a vampire bat. And he was from the museum. And one of the constable whispered at Thornton's ear, telling him something that it might be very important. Watson and Holmes went to the dock and found two guys playing poker. So Holmes and Watson asked some of the sailors who were playing poker to have a look around in their shipment in their boats. And they opened up the crate, and lo and behold, Thornton, turns out that Thornton found a whole group of people completely dead along with their dogs. This crap's got real. And the only witness he found was, of course, a woman who was traumatized, like she saw something she couldn't believe. Meanwhile, in the crate where Holmes and Watson found, in that crate they found skeletons in it. Who ship a crate full of skeletons? It turns out that those were the bodies of. It turns out that the somebody had an eyewitness. It turns out that there were a group of kids who was trapped inside of an apartment building. Well, at the same time, they think they got Spring Hill Jack inside, but it turns out it was an aggressive dog. And that dog just attacked one of the victims, while at the same time a bunch of the constables firing their guns right toward the building. And one of their head constable told them to cease fire. Must be Thornton. Well, turns out it was an aggressive dog, and that's their theory. And Thornton is getting all just riled up on this whole thing until Sherlock Holmes kind of helps straighten him out. So they went to another building, knocked on the door, and one of the servants let him in, telling him that somebody named Tom is dead. And Sherlock Holmes found something that is really remarkable. Turns out that they're in a psychic seance going on. And in the middle of the seance, there's a glowing orb going on. And as usual, they open up the door, turn on the light. It was a hoax. And the guy doing the seance got arrested. Meanwhile, the butcher showed up. I mean, sometimes it gets a little confusing sometimes, but anyway, the butcher showed up in the middle of the street, tossing out any body remains from all of his butchering, and he saw somebody who looks like he's been through hell, like he was beat up or something. Meanwhile, Thornton starts interrogating the suspect while Holmes was watching and observing him. And one thing I had to say about Thornton, he's really aggressive when he's interrogating somebody. Until somebody showed up with a mustache and goatee telling Thornton that they got the wrong man. So they had to release him. And now a group of constables is looking for somebody named Hitchcock. And Hitchcock told him to go away. And the guy who told Thornton that they are interrogating the wrong man, he has evidence, a piece of paper that pretty much proves his innocence. But Thornton, he's not taking that lying down. He even threatened him if he so much do another case, he'll go after him. But Holmes, on the other hand, he looked at the piece of paper, looked through the journal. Turns out it was a map. And even they found some that kind of, it looks like one of those gunpowders that explode right in front of them while they were looking at the area, searching about. And of course Sherlock found a bunch of books that pretty much has got to do with the Liverpool legend and such. And they found an underground tunnel. And in that underground tunnel, full of filth. While at the same time, Thornton barge into a zoo area full of cages of animals and such. And then Thornton gets hit in the head by a 2x4. While Watson and Holmes starts looking the underground area. And sadly, Holmes pulled a chain and now the tunnel started to flood. So he told Watson to run. One was making sure that Watson was okay. Meanwhile, Thornton got knocked out, and it becomes a huge fight between the guy with the mustache against Thornton. I mean, they both had a brawl. I mean, they've been wailing at each other, punching and hitting and kicking and all. And then the bad guy with the big mustache grabs Thornton and tries to toss him over to a pit full of growling, angry dogs. I mean, all going all rawr, 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 rawr. And even they're all making noises like hack, 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 hack. Oh, they're hyenas. Hyenas. Who would have thought of that? Anyway, he was going to toss Thornton over so the hyenas would attack him. Meanwhile, Sherlock Holmes and Watson swim their way to get out, and Watson finally escapes. Meanwhile, there was a guy who was digging a hole in the ground, and out comes Watson completely soaked. I mean, not Watson, but Sherlock completely soaked. Meanwhile, the bad guy who was about ready to kill Thornton, he was about ready to hurl him to his doom until a butcher showed up with a cleaver next to his throat, telling him to let go of Thornton. But, of course, the bad guy headbutts him. Meanwhile, they found a bunch of sailors found Watson, and they gave him a blanket, and a lady poured hot, warm water for his feet. Holmes, on the other hand, saw the two gravediggers, and he wants them to go to another tunnel, and they want them to use their chalk to draw arrows so they won't get lost. Meanwhile, the butcher wrestled with the bad guy, and Thornton fell into the pit, but turns out that Thornton hung on to the edge, and when the bad guy was kneeling over to see if he went down, Thornton grabbed him by the collar and tossed him into the pit, while the butcher was shocked to notice that Thornton survived. Meanwhile, Watson, with a group of other sailors, got their boats, and they roll all the way to the ship area to find the tunnel. Turns out that they were using the legend as a cover, and of course it turns out it was hyenas who was doing the sound and making people think it was the Spring Hill Jack. Because they always say that hyenas, they always make that laughing sound, and one thing I always heard about the hyenas, they make those laughing sounds when they're either nervous or aggressive. And one bad guy tries to knock down Watson, and even try to kill him with a meat hook that he was carrying, but got distracted by a bat who just flew over their head. So thank goodness for the bat. But of course, Watson knocks out the guy who's trying to kill him, while the other guy tries to make his escape. Somebody fire a gun at the boat, where it turns out it had gunpowder in it. So now, perfect end for a perfect day. Watson, Holmes, and Thornton finally got back together and pretty much figured out what they discovered. Turns out the whole Spring Hill Jack was a ruse for the dog fights, and they were smuggling hyenas into England. Now, even though he gave Holmes a hard time, he does have to admit that Holmes did a pretty good job of solving the case, and he even shook hands to Holmes while Holmes goes back to London. Now, the third story was kind of confusing at the times. I mean, it went to one way to another, a lot of odds and ends, but it was not bad for a story of its time. And these are the stories of the Sherlock Holmes Omnibus I reviewed to you. And one thing I heard so far is that Dynamite Entertainment did another Sherlock Holmes story, and it was Sherlock Holmes versus Harry Houdini. Now, that kind of makes a lot of sense, but why versus? Because I always heard that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, he was good friends with Harry Houdini. Despite of Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, he believed in the supernatural, while Harry Houdini, he hated psychics. He found them frauds and all. So, despite of their beliefs, they still become friends. Kind of reminds me of most of the friends I make. I'm a Republican, and I make friends who are Democrats. And despite our point of view of politics, we still act like friends because we have something else in common. Doctor Who and superhero things, and of course Disney. Of course, there are some Disney things I like, some I don't. So, for those of you who enjoy my comic book so far, please leave a comment down below, hit like and subscribe. And I'm going to be taking off this hat, but keeping the shirt. Later, guys.